Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you for our wonderful tech crew here and the music and everything else. So I'd first like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose land we are on and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I really thank you for coming today, and please, this is a topic that obviously has some sensitivity, so please keep any questions and discussions respectful. Everyone will have different views, which is fine, but yes, please just keep that in mind. So thank you all. I organised this panel with 5 fantastic speakers, and it was really hard to actually narrow it down because there's so many amazing people talking on this. But I think everyone will give you a sort of a different perspective and a different insight, particularly on the ground insights. And I organised this panel because of the ongoing silence in the university space in particular around, what has happened in Gaza, around the genocide that has occurred there and is continuing to occur. And because I think that this is an ongoing live issue, and even though we were talking about this panel discussion in July, I said it's no resolution that's going to happen in December. And even with a ceasefire, of course, it's really not a ceasefire, it's ongoing. So I think that this is a really interesting panel, not just for reflecting on Gaza and the West Bank, but also for reflecting on human rights and humanitarianism more broadly. What does this mean? And I think that we can't, even if we're looking at other humanitarian crises, we can't look away from what has happened and what is happening here, because the so-called promotion of human rights and the promotion of the liberal international order is clearly, undermined when countries such as Australia and others are complicit in war crimes. But anyway, that's my opinion, and these 5 people all have different opinions, and so I would like to introduce them. First of all, I'm very delighted to have Dr. Ali Shaar, who's currently the director of the Palestinian Child Institute at An-Najah National University in Nablus, Palestine. With 30 years of experience in public health, health system development and humanitarian response, Dr. Shaar has been part of many programs and projects addressing the impact of war and conflict on children, women and health systems in the Arab world. And Dr. Shaar is working with Dr. Cadhla O'Sullivan, and they will present together, who is a research fellow at the Children's Policy Centre at Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. Her research areas focus broadly on issues of child justice, children's human rights, and child-centred research methodologies. Her PhD focuses on participatory rights-based research with children on peacekeeping and peace-building practices. And then we have Mr. Mudasser Siddiqui, who's with Plan International Australia, who has over 15 years of humanitarian and development experience across Asia, Africa and the Middle East. Mudasser started his career working on disability rights issues, and he has had extensive experience in Afghanistan, with ActionAid International, in Zimbabwe, and with multiple NGOs across the world, and of course in managing the Palestinian response. Dr. Brennan is an emergency medicine and public health physician, specialising in humanitarian assistance, epidemic and pandemic preparedness and emergency management. He has extensive experience in over 50 countries across 5 continents, most recently as Regional Emergency Director for the World Health Organization in the Eastern Mediterranean region. He has also had numerous senior management and technical positions, and he has, recently returned to Australia. And Amra didn't give me a very long bio, but is amazing, of course, and is a humanitarian practitioner who has worked for the UN and international NGOs in the Middle East. And she's a PhD researcher researching protecting civilians in a changing world order. So thank you very much to this wonderful panel. We'll get started with Dr. Ali Shaar and Dr. Cadhla O'Sullivan. Do you want to start?
Good morning to you all, and thank you, Annabel, for your kind introduction to myself. I'm really pleased to be with you Good morning again. And obviously, my colleagues in the panel are very distinguished colleagues, so I'm not going to take very much details about the situation, what is happening in Gaza or Palestine, but I want to put everyone within the frame about Palestine and the issues that are happening there, so that we are able, as a conclusion, to provide some words about what needs to be done so that this crisis is stopped and healed. I want to say that basically there is a chronology in what is happening in Palestine or in Gaza. The chronology is saying that things did not happen in October the 7th. I want to say that basically in 1948, it did start by the annexation of 800,000 people from Palestine to different other countries, including to Gaza, whereby we know that 70% of the Gaza population are refugees as from 1948 or 1967. In addition of that, there is 18 years of strict closure over Gaza. Strict closure means nothing can go in, nothing can go out without strict control and permission. And there has been 9 wars over Gaza. And I would say, frankly, an 18-year-old child would have gone through 6 wars. And you could know what that means on the child. All of that resulted in high unemployment and high poverty, with 80% of the population before October the 7th were dependent on food aid. And of course, everyone knows the political division between the West Bank authorities and Gaza authorities that has resulted in dysfunctional development and dysfunctional even humanitarian response. And October 7th, it did not happen out of the blue. What I said before has culminated a lot of frustration, a lot of feeling desperate, and a lot of unbearable social and economic conditions for the people, including also political difficulties. You said genocide. The ICJ is investigating into the situation being a genocide or not a genocide. I think it's a genocide. However, every one of us have been looking at what is happening, and we got it on our phones. I'm not going to cite numbers here because these are changing by the minute, and they are very graphic. We saw children shattered in pieces. We saw amputations where 4,000 people during the last 2 years incurred amputations, leaving Gaza as the #1 per capita amputees in the world in just 2 years. The deaths, the destruction of families, and the destruction of hopes, the destruction of future, the destruction of dreams, the destruction of education, the destruction of the culture, everything. So basically, 90% of the population is displaced. And after all of that, a ceasefire has been declared in January and 2025, and then unilaterally breached with complete blockade of humanitarian aid and complete insult attacks on the civil population in Gaza, and famine declared 22nd of August 2025, with many of children dying. But high percent of children suffering from acute malnutrition, leaving very deep scars on their bodies. With food distribution traps that we know about that resulted in the killing of more than 3,000 and injured of more 60,000. But again, a ceasefire in October was declared. A ceasefire, what ceasefire? Continued attacks on infrastructure. More than 300 people were killed after the ceasefire. Only 10% of the agreed on humanitarian aid was entering Gaza. They say that Gaza, before October the 7th, needed 600 trucks of aid or goods into it. After the war, it will need more, but yet what gets into Gaza is only around 100 trucks. Living conditions deteriorating. Displaced population needed 300,000 tents or shelter facilities. What was entering Gaza so far is only about 20,000, with winter coming in, with the rain coming in. And on top of all of that, the perspective for a political solution is yet not existent. So that is the situation. And when we talk about children, I think we need really to ask this question: was the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on Child Rights, upholded? Was it upholded? I know I'm putting you in a very gloomy and dark situation to look at, but this is what we call reality from the field. I'm honored. I am honored to be part of the team working on the article about child rights in Palestine, together with Cadhla and Professor Sharon. So, Cadhla, if you want to add to this, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. And I won't speak for long because I am certainly not best placed to speak on this issue. I met Ali a few years ago when I was supposed to do my PhD in Palestine, and I'm very honoured to be working alongside him. He does amazing work. But as he said, we have, at the moment it's under review, but we have written an article together with Ali and Professor Shaar on the rights and needs of children in times of war and conflict. I think the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is vitally important. I think everyone agrees on that. But I do think that often the concept of human rights can be abstract, particularly when we're talking about these times of crisis and how they have been completely violated. I think often there is a narrowing of children's life worlds to just merely survival, because that is the case in times of war and conflict. But, I think in moving forward, we need to think about how we can build more than that, because children's right to education, to everything that builds their lives now but also for the future, has been completely decimated in Palestine. And in doing that, in Gaza, I should say. And also in that article, we really want to highlight that we're trying to centre children. This is not a case of who's right and who's wrong. And we have quoted Byman's article in this to say that ultimately everyone is lost in this, because children will suffer the most, and we need to think about how we can centre children to move forward and beyond this. In doing so, we have, or to try and kind of think about the lived realities of children in their life worlds, we have applied a systems model. And again, hopefully the article will be out soon that speaks to this much better, but we talk about the microsystem, such as parents and family, the mesosystem, which talks about the direct supports outside immediate relationships, the exosystem, such as the systems that are indirectly impacting children through social values. We have the geopolitical system, and of course, as Ali said, the chronosystem. This has played out for decades now. And we know through psychological research that that will have an ongoing impact. And I think it's very clear that the systems that support children and their families or act as buffers or protective factors in these situations have been completely destroyed for Gazan children. And And I think it's also important to say that, as Ali mentioned, like, this didn't start in October 2023, and it was also played out in front of all of our eyes through mainstream media. And I think that we all have an obligation to continue this conversation and to also act for children in Gaza to ensure that the of never again doesn't ring hollow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Ali and Kayla, and we'll move now to Mudasser.
Thank you. I think Dr. Ali and Kayla have really painted a picture that should be something that should shake our conscience and force us all and many people outside here to act. I just want to take a pause and a step back to see and tell you where the situation is with regard to children in conflict. Currently in the world, there are 450 million children living in fragile and conflict-affected locations. If we were to put them all together in one location, that will be the third largest country after China and India. 450 million children. And I think within those vulnerable and conflict-affected children, the children of Gaza would be perhaps, if not at the bottom, quite near, along with children from Sudan and many other places. I wouldn't necessarily go into details as Dr. Ali has given a very strong account of situation. But before coming here, I was talking to my colleagues and partners on the ground. And two things are emerging. One, that over 500 violations of so-called ceasefire have happened between 10th of October and yesterday. And as Dr. Ali mentioned, hundreds have been killed. And as always, children and women bear a disproportionate burden of those casualties. There is fear and uncertainty, with 95% of schools and health infrastructure completely decimated. And the impact on children and on girls because of all those things is profound. But there is another thing that is emerging. Children are talking about tomorrow. They are starting to talk about future. In our work on the ground, in education centers, temporary learning centers that we have set up, when children are drawing, they are starting to draw butterflies. Sign of life, hope, and future. Listening to children talk about future in a place filled with uncertainty and suffering is a sign of hope that we are witnessing, and that is a strong enough motivation for me and my partners and colleagues on the ground to not only continue with what we are doing, but do everything possible to scale up our humanitarian response over there. Plan International, along with our partners, we started sending aid into Gaza since the beginning of the conflict through our operations in Egypt and our partnership with the Egyptian Red Crescent and the National Alliance in Egypt. Since the so-called ceasefire, we have sent more than 100 trucks. We, of course, prioritized life-saving food assistance. We supported partners to run community kitchens on the ground. We also sent educational supplies. We have been supporting with MHPSS and protection services. But there are tremendous constraints. We can send tents, but we cannot send pellets. We cannot send nails, pins. So how do you carry on with the work when there is so-called access, but the constraints are put at every level? When a truck gets loaded and sent off, we are not sure it's actually going to make it. A lot of them get turned back. Of course, the frequency of trucks being sent back has reduced since this CMCC has been set up and other mechanisms, but it is not the level of access that is needed in normal situations, and this is definitely not a normal situation in Gaza. Engagement with the communities and partners on the ground is something that we as Plan International have learned. This is a very unique situation for us. And what we have realized is that the local organizations, they are the first one to respond, and sometimes they are the only one to respond because they are the only ones out there. They have the legitimacy, they have the trust, and if I can put it a bit crudely, they have the skin in the game because it's about their family, it's about, their community. And what we have done and are trying to do and will continue to do is to really put them at the forefront in helping and shaping the response that the humanitarian organizations should be doing on the ground. Our other approach really has been to engage with well-established organizations on the ground. We have long-drawn partnerships with some of them, like the Mercy Malaysia, International Medical Corps, UK Med, who are highly specialized medical agencies. But we are working with them on how we can, with this limited infrastructure, make sure that while they are continuing with what they are doing and we can come in and engage with children, give them some safe space, give them some learning material, give them some nutrition. And nutrition is a big challenge because the supplies are going in, but what is being allowed in what quantity is a challenge in itself. It's a very interesting anecdote I want to leave you with, is that when we are sending nutrition supplies, somebody, not in my organization, but in one of the coordination centers, felt out of compassion that perhaps the children of Gaza need chocolate chip cookie. They were sent in, but a child's body that has experienced extreme forms of malnutrition, is that really ready to take that processed food? I think, Dr. Brennan will be able to explain more about that. Certainly not what, the health experts on the ground are telling us. They need supplies in a quantity, in a manner, and type of supplies that are relevant to the context of Gaza. And that's where the local expertise, that's where the local context, and that's where the local partners come into place. I just want to conclude by really saying that Plan International and our partners and organizations like us are doing what we can, and we are really grateful to the solidarity of the Australian public and many others in supporting our work. But I would like us to remember that this so-called ceasefire, as I've mentioned earlier, has been violated 500 times already. It has not stopped killing and has not stopped suffering. So it is not a tap that has just been turned on and off. There are long-term implications. So therefore, it is very important that we do not turn our eyes away from the children of Gaza and stand in solidarity with them. Thank you.
Over to Dr. Rick. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Annabel, and really appreciate the invitation. to participate today. Feeling a little overdressed. My old boss would say, you do not look like a field guy if you're going to walk in dressed like that. So Mudasser said he wanted to take a step and frame things. I'd like to do something similar. My first humanitarian movement in Bosnia in 1993, so I've been involved in this field for quite some time. I would say today it's never been a tougher time for communities caught up in humanitarian crises, and it's never been a tougher time for humanitarian practitioners. So if you look across the world today, Mudasser shared some data. I'm a data guy, so bear with me. There are 305 million people in need of humanitarian assistance worldwide today. That's 4 times the number in 2015. There are 123 million people forcibly displaced worldwide as refugees, IDPs, asylum seekers, the refugees from Palestine. That's the highest since the end of the Second World War. There are 130 active conflicts according to the ICRC. Again, the highest number since the end of the Second World War. At the same time, we're seeing decline in respect for international humanitarian law, international human rights, international norms. Last year, there were 599, let's say 600 attacks on humanitarian workers worldwide. That is a 4-fold increase since 2015. WHO, who I worked for 13 years, I just retired in January, we set up a surveillance system for attacks on healthcare in 2018. We've documented 9,200 attacks since 2018. Of course, the trend line is going like that. Not one person has been held to account. Not one. Gross violations of international humanitarian law. So all the trend lines are going in the wrong direction, and at the same time, our resources to meet these soaring needs is plummeting. So if you look at all the humanitarian funding to date for this year, it's 44% less than we had last year, and next year it'll fall off an even steeper cliff. It's not just the funding, it's the way that it happened. The US, the largest humanitarian funder, who was given 77% less this year than they did last year, as of the end of November, if you go to the OCHA's financial tracking service. So it was that acute withdrawal of funding, but it's also the political attacks that humanitarian assistance is under. So, of course, USAID is dismantled. None of us saw that coming, even with a conservative Trump administration coming in. It was never projected in this Project 2025, which laid out. Humanitarians are being described as criminal, corrupt, incompetent, lazy. So if you speak to my colleagues in USAID, one of the hardest things for them is not just the dismantling of the programs, the way that they, as dedicated professionals, serving the most vulnerable populations on the planet, have been portrayed by their political leaders. It's just shocking. And you can imagine, I've retired now, so I'm spending half my time in the US and half my time here. And you can imagine how the morale is amongst humanitarians and public health workers in the US and globally. Is there any good news? There is good news. So the good news is, and I think the record shows, that when we as humanitarians, when we're given access to populations in need and we're given resources, we can deliver and achieve amazing outcomes. And I've got, again, being the data guy, I've worked across 22 countries, Middle East and North Africa, the last 5.5 years, whether it's outcomes from cholera outbreaks, severe acute malnutrition, trauma care, external evaluations of our work. When we're given access and we're given resources, we deliver, and there's plenty of data to demonstrate that. Of course, the humanitarian system, with all these developments, is really having to reflect deeply, and there are a number of reform processes going on, and I'm sure we'll have other forums to discuss the key elements of those reforms. So let me shift gears again and go back to Gaza. Dr. Ali said he didn't want to go through the data, but I do. Again, sorry. So again, if we look at what has happened in Gaza, we've got 70,000 people killed. You know, some estimates up to 2/3 of those women and children. 170,000 people injured, of which 42,000 have been left with permanent injuries at a time where rehabilitation services have been completely destroyed and dismantled. 92% of homes destroyed, 94% of hospitals damaged or destroyed, 93% of schools destroyed. Those are from 3 different assessments. Famine, 1.9 million people displaced. So, you know, you're familiar with all that. You only have to go online, look at the videos, listen to the testimonials of the aid workers coming out. And I was based in Cairo. We had a huge operation in Gaza. I've spoken to scores of humanitarian workers. Every one of them said it's the worst crisis they've ever participated in. Now, you know, not many of us are getting access to Darfur right now, but you know, so that's the context. Now we've got the ceasefire. What's happening there? Well, there has not been a substantial increase in aid, and I've spoken to the heads of 2 UN agencies inside Gaza just the last few days. None of them, they're saying it's a more flexible operating environment. There is less violence, but as others have said, there's still close to 400 deaths since the ceasefire. So there hasn't been the ratcheting up of aid that we had expected. Now you've heard about the yellow line dividing Gaza into the red zone and the green zone. The green zone occupied by Palestine, where around anywhere between 51 and 58% of the territory is located. The red zone, again, Mawasi area on the coast, completely overcrowded, completely under-resourced in terms of basic services. And that's where the vast majority of Palestinians are now living. There is a plan now by the Trump administration in the green zone, to establish about 10 of these settlements, which are going to be big camps, around 25,000 per camp, where there will be shelter, there will be schools, there will be medical care. Again, it's not going to be run by the UN or the better-known NGOs. You all knew what happened with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Thankfully, they've ceased to be, but they're going to bring in other contractors, other US contractors, as part of US government foreign policy now. We're using our aid and our development assistance to advance US national interests. So that's the direction of travel. At the same time, the UN Security Council last month passed a resolution that basically endorsed the Trump comprehensive plan for Gaza. And that has, again, in the planning process, very little, basically zero consultation with the UN. There is this civil military coordination cell, which is just a process for sucking up information from the operational agencies on the ground. No consultation with the UN, no consultation with the Palestinians as the plan evolves. So the idea is that there will be this transitional authority under the aegis of a board of peace, which Mr. Trump himself will chair. There'll be an international stabilization force to demilitarize Gaza, and police force ensure security, but it's all vague. There have been, to my knowledge, no commitments of military forces to that stabilization force. And then there's the financing issue. Where is the money going to come from? So the UN and the Ministry of Health and operational partners, they've been sidelined, but they're not doing it. They're not doing nothing. They're getting on. They've got their transitional plan. They're doing their assessments. There is a damage and needs assessment ongoing right now. It was done in January. Those estimates were that it was going to be $53 billion to reconstruct Gaza. So you can imagine what the next assessment is going to demonstrate. So WHO's worked with the Ministry of Health. They've got a plan. They're progressively expanding access to healthcare. 4 hospitals have come online. Now 18 of 36 hospitals are partially functioning. None of them are fully functioning. Just a few weeks ago, only 14 were. Another few clinics are coming online. So expansion of services are ongoing, and as Mudasser said, we've got to draw our inspiration from the Palestinians because they're incredibly resilient people. And if you've been in Gaza, you see what resourceful and resilient and proactive people they are. I've got to wind up here, but clearly I've got a lot more to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Annabel, for organising this important conversation, and thanks also to the panellists. I'm going to zoom in, and then I'm going to zoom back out with the theme of the panel around what this means for humanitarianism and human rights. So I'm a practitioner, researcher, but also completing a PhD on protecting civilians in a changing world order, and I think Gaza illustrates my thesis in frightening ways that I hadn't anticipated. So if we look at famine in Gaza, we have over 100 children confirmed have died of famine so far, according to the UN. We have 54,000 children who are suffering from acute malnutrition, which increases the risk of premature death. And then we know the children that survive have lifelong consequences, and we also know that evidence shows this can be passed through generations. So this is a deliberate strategy of war, and I think what's been a real challenge with helping the wider public understand this is that people have had this misconception that it is a natural phenomenon as opposed to being man-made. And famine expert Alex Duval has been really provided very full insights into this, where he said, based on his analysis, it's the most minutely, precisely engineered starvation that he has seen, and unprecedented in that the necessary aid has always been sitting an hour away at the border, and that it has been a deliberate strategy to stop that aid and to stop the necessary humanitarian personnel coming in to stop the famine. So in addition to Gaza having had a famine declared in August, but there was a lot of challenges in terms of mis and disinformation, I think, in the political media space that could communicate and cut through what I think were deliberate strategies trying to confuse things. And so while this imminent risk of famine was unfolding, the system that was in place, the UN-led system that could stop the famine, was being progressively prevented from doing the work it needed to do. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was being devised. Oh, you've got the slide, thank you. So it came about in May 2025 in mysterious circumstances with sort of dubious funding, and it still has a lot of opaqueness around how it came about and who was involved. But from what we do know, none of it suggested, well, I think people were very quick to call out that it was not a humanitarian organisation. There were political and other agendas behind this. And we had lots of warnings of the risks that civilians were going to face when you removed 400 distribution sites and replaced them with 4 sites concentrated in militarised zones in the south that required desperate civilians to travel long distances on unsafe routes. So we have nearly 1,400 Palestinians that were killed simply trying to access aid. And even though it has been stopped operating as of November, I think in terms of what my WHO colleague was alluding to, in terms of these disturbing trends, and I think attacks on the UN as well, in his parting comments, he said, "Many positive aspects of our model and operations should be considered to improve aid distribution in Gaza and other parts of the world facing conflict." I think we should really listen to that. We know that it's not true, but I think we need to pay attention as humanitarians in terms of defending humanitarian space and calling these things out for what they are, which is they do not comply with humanitarian principles. They place civilians at greater risk, and I think we need to really interrogate the practices and institutions and people involved. And I noticed that in the recent Commission of Inquiry report, in September that found reasonable grounds to conclude genocide is occurring, it paid particular attention to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And particularly, it pointed to its establishment and the assertion of control over aid at a time of imminent risk of famine, supported the intention of Israeli authorities to continuously impose starvation and unlivable conditions for life for Palestinians. So in terms of what does this mean? It's obviously had devastating consequences for Gaza, but it has consequences for civilians everywhere. We've had this degradation of the laws, norms, and institutions that were designed to protect civilians and preserve humanity. And I think, what we've seen in Gaza has been shocking. We also don't exactly know what's happening in al-Fasher Sudan, because there's also this pattern and strategy of governments preventing humanitarians from being present, from a range of strategies, from denying visas to attacks on humanitarian personnel. So again, I think we need to be really strong in defending humanitarian space and defending principled humanitarian action. So in terms of, sitting in Australia, it can feel a bit removed, but third states have responsibilities. They have responsibilities under international humanitarian law. They have a duty to respect and uphold respect. So that means we need to take actions to hold other parties and other people that we have the capacity to influence to respect their obligations and to preserve humanity in war. And that can come through accountability, but can come through looking at all sorts of relationships that we have. And then coming to the recent Commission of Inquiry finding on genocide, there's been a growing body of evidence around that. And I think there's again been some confusion here because we've had ample warning from January from the ICJ that there was a risk. And we probably won't have a determination from the ICJ until 2027. But there's a duty to prevent, so that requires us to take action. And I think we need clarity around that. We don't wait for a famine to be declared. We don't wait for genocide to be declared. We have to act to prevent it. So with that, I will hand over to Annabel to facilitate the discussion.
I'd just like to thank our 5 panellists and give them a big round of applause. Thank you. We timed the presentations to be fairly short so that we could have time for discussion, and also if anyone wants to ask questions or make a comment, we might take, if there are questions or comments, we might take 3 in turn and then ask the panel to respond. Do we have any questions? Yes, thank you.
Hi there, Imogen from ACFID. I just recently returned to Australia from working on this response from the West Bank, so thank you for this very interesting discussion. I would like to bring this to the responsibility from third parties moving forward. I think we've seen a disproportionate amount of risk absorbed from humanitarian workers in Gaza. They're the ones collecting all the data on the ground that inform the IPC famine report. They're the ones implementing, doing this response under incredibly difficult conditions. However, in my experience working, say, in Jerusalem, meeting with Western donor governments there, I'm not going to mention who, but multiple ones that said, we as NGOs need to do more to raise the alarm and do more, comms and be more outspoken. And I want to really challenge that and say, no, it's too risky for us when we have colleagues on the ground who could be targeted because of that advocacy. And so I really want to look at, maybe ask you who you think that responsibility lies with to actually, on accountability, because it's disproportionate in this response from those humanitarian workers, UN agencies, local NGOs on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Yes, up the back and then down the front. Or down the front we'll go first because of the mics, and then up the back.
Thank you, and thanks, panellists, and thank you to you and your organisations for all of the work that you do. Circling to the broader theme about the fitness of the humanitarian system, it seems that it's not really an issue with the humanitarian system. It's a political issue. That's where all the problems arise. I've heard some very positive discussion about what the humanitarian actors are doing in Gaza. So my question is, are you happy that the system fit for purpose the way that it was, pre the issues? I'll just start again. Before the issues that we've been discussing, or is there some way it needs to be improved given the political context that we're in now?
Thank you. Up the back.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you, actually leads on from that question as well, a little bit about the donor landscape in Gaza. I know Australian government has predominantly directed its funds for the crisis through UN agencies, but I was quite interested in hearing Mudasser about talking about that localised response, and I wondered where is it most impactful to potentially sort of channel the limited resources that are available for the crisis, especially given all those constraints that you've all discussed around access and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Is he around? No. Okay. All right. Dr. Ali's dropped off, but please, yes, respond. You can take it in turn if you like.
I can respond to the political if you want.
Oh, actually, there's a mic. Yeah, keep that one.
I can respond to the political. And yes, I was thinking about that as I was preparing my talk. I was like, I wanted to help people understand that the humanitarian system is a threat and that we need to do better, but also that other actors have greater responsibilities. And I think it is the threats on the humanitarian system are political. This is what I'm studying and what my research is showing, that there is increasingly strategic coordinated attacks on the system to remove the UN system. And I think we saw that in the comment from the parting GHF executive director. They want to remove the system, an independent principles system, and replace it with something that is more compliant to political agendas. So if you listen to the Security Council, and one of my interviewees, Martin Griffiths, the former emergency relief coordinator, he often said to the council, like, people would come to him on the sidelines and say, oh, what more can we do on this crisis? How do we help? And I think people genuinely want to help. But he said, do your job. Like, bring that political weight and attention and put your pressure on the parties. That is what, and that's what I meant when I said respect and ensure respect for law. Member states that want to preserve a rules-based order have to come together to defend that order and put pressure on the parties. But one thing I will say for humanitarians is we have to find ways to cut through the disinformation, because the information environment is getting more and more challenging. But yeah.
So let me start with the last question, and I'll respond to then the second last one as well. I think in terms of where is it most impactful for the resources to go, it is the local organizations. Because as I was saying in my presentation, they have the trust, they have the first-hand information, they have the legitimacy of being on the ground, knowing what they're doing, and what they need from us is support to strengthen them, but not to replace them. And I think that's something that the entire international humanitarian system has to learn and start practicing. We've been talking a lot about it, for at least 10 years since the Grand Bargain, if not before, in 2015 onwards, 16 onwards, but we need to really put it in practice. Now, there is a role for other parts of the system, because I would not want us to put disproportionate burden on those local organizations as well, because they have always been and continue to be under-resourced, understaffed. In terms of, is the system fit for purpose? Depends on what is the purpose. It's expecting, is a Band-Aid good for a scratch? Definitely. Is it good for a space where a surgery is needed? Absolutely not. Humanitarian system was set up, or was claimed to be set up, to respond to humanitarian needs. But what we are seeing is that the humanitarian needs are a symptom to a much more profound political and geostrategic failure of the forces that may be. So yes, the system is not fit for purpose because it has been designed to solve a problem that it was not supposed to be solving in the first place. Within the constraints of humanitarian system and the humanitarian work, does it need improvement? Absolutely. Has it made an attempt? To some extent. Has it actually achieved the level of improvement that it is needed to have? Absolutely not. And that is to do with the way the system has been funded, controlled, and expected to perform. So until and unless we really address those fundamental underlying issues of international order, expecting just the symptom to improve without proper diagnosis and treatment, we are not going to get very far.
Thanks very much. Pardon me. There's a lot in those questions. So, transfer of risk. This is one of the tensions that we have. If we want to do more localization, we are transferring more risk to local partners. So it's not, one of the problems has been is like we can't get access to that area. Over to you. You can't operate like that. We've got in that localization agenda to build capacity, to promote protection and so on. So that's, and I think this is a struggle that we sometimes have. On that need for greater advocacy, I think that's pretty disingenuous of the people that you were meeting with. How much more advocacy can we do? I can tell you, I met with numerous high-level political delegations coming through Cairo, because we're in Cairo and this is where they came. This is the operational base from Al Arish. Very senior people in US government, British government, European Union, Italians, blah, blah, blah. You would lay out the facts. They never pushed back. They knew what was going on. Not once I never had, if I laid out the harshest of facts, I never had one politician push back on me. So I think that's very disingenuous. We've done all the advocacy. You only have to go online, and the testimonials of people coming out have been extraordinary. And they have testified to the Security Council and so on. So anyway, I like to meet those people. On humanitarian assistance, is it fit for purpose? I think Mudasser's response was pretty good there. Look, we're under attack. Multilateralism's under attack. Humanitarianism is under attack. Public health is under attack. And unfortunately, I think for we as humanitarians, I think some of the attack, some of the toughest and most inappropriate is internal right now. I mean, things have changed enormously. We have to adapt, we have to reform. And in fact, any large, complex enterprise like humanitarian action is always having to do internal reflection and adjustments. And we've been through 4 rounds of humanitarian reform since 2005. We had the reform of 2005, the establishment of the clusters and the SURF. Then we had the transformative agenda, which I think was the most effective period of humanitarian reform. Mudasser referred to the grand bargain. We haven't delivered on the grand bargain from 2016, and it's ongoing, particularly in the areas of localization, of accountability, of humanitarian funding. But and so now we're going through this other round of humanitarian reform called the Humanitarian Reset. And it is going to focus more and more on issues like localization, like different funding mechanisms, cash transfers, pooled funding, and so on. There's going to be a big report in the Lancet next year. So there's the Humanitarian Reset being led by Tom Fletcher from OCHA, and then there's a Lancet Commission on conflict health, forced displacement. So there will be a lot of recommendations coming out of those. Guilty is charged on a number of things in the humanitarian system. I do agree that most of the conflict-related crises, these are political crises. There's no humanitarian answer to a political crisis. We You know, we provide life-saving services, we reduce suffering, we try to lay a foundation for long-term recovery, but unless there is good governance coming in, unless there is sustainable financing, you know, those foundations, you know, the development actors have to come in and take over. But, you know, some of the things I don't like about the humanitarian system, I don't like the competition, I don't like the flag waving, I don't like the turf battles, and I don't like the fact that we haven't sufficiently localised our response. But I think we are getting there.
Ali, and Kayla, did you want to respond? Sure. Okay, maybe in the next round. Does anyone want to ask any questions? Yep, okay. Just into order of who put them up, over here, Leanne. The person next to you, and then there's a person there. So, sorry, they're very, very quick on this side. So I'll look over this way next time, I promise. Okay.
It's the direction you're facing, isn't it? Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you to the panel. That was so informative and giving us a little bit, tiny bit of hope in the context of a lot of things that aren't very hopeful. We talked about local organisations and how we can all support those Palestinians on the ground. And I wanted to share a call for support that we received as Australia's National Human Rights Institution, the Australian Human Rights Commission. The Australian government is a great supporter of national human rights institutions. They lead resolutions in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly on the importance of national human rights institutions. Just so happens that there is an excellent Palestinian national human rights institution. They've been on the ground throughout this current conflict. They have lost colleagues, they've lost officers, they're in desperate need of support, and this panel is about supporting human rights in Gaza and Palestine. Then I think if you can all keep them in mind in terms of your advocacy with Australia as a third party in terms of how we can support human rights protection, that would be great.
Thank you. Actually, I think my question is for Amra. I was thinking about the quote that you presented from the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which sort of fills me with great alarm. And my question is, how do humanitarians preserve humanitarian space in a context of corporate takeover? And as a footnote to that, I mean, I note that this conference, 7 of the 9 funders of this conference are managing contractors and organisations of that ilk.
Thank you. My question is for Mudasser, Dr. Ali and Kayla. Having worked in child rights and now working in women's rights movement, I'm just conscious that women are a little bit absent from this conversation. It's incredibly important to focus on child rights, but we know that children don't live in isolation of communities. And I'm wondering how we can, across humanitarian aid in general, but really bring women, fathers and mothers, but parents, women in particular, who respond to so much, are responsible, obviously, providing that first safe space for their children. How do we bring them more into this conversation without diluting the fact that child rights are such an important part of these conversations?
Thank you. Hello? Oh, sorry. I won't do karaoke. Thank you so much to the statement and the 2 questions. Could we, Ali, do you want to respond first about women and child rights and that nexus?
Yes, and before I do that, I want to say a big thanks to my colleagues in the panel, because I was honored to hear what they say, and obviously there is a great work done on the ground, and with these heroes, I think we will overcome. Now, it's a very important question, because Even if you want to work on the child healing, even if you want to work on boosting or supporting the child right within such a complex situation, you need to build on this continuum, you know, the child-centeredness with the family, with the community, with the institutions. I think we need to take that into consideration. However, we are in the mode of trying to provide the healing services. As my colleagues were saying, there are excellent organizations on the ground. I can testify that also there are huge capacities that are knowledgeable, first, on providing first aid, second, on encompassing the child right into their everyday practice, and again, having the fathers and the mothers as partners. In fact, the situation on the ground now is the complete displacement of the Palestinian community in Gaza, where high unemployment leave the family, the father and the mother around, which is an opportunity to work with them. The last thing I want to say is that the people on the ground have the capacity, but also they are creative. They create the means out of nothing. They create the tools, they create the activities, and they create whatever they need, so that even with low-resourced situation, they are able to work together. And of course, the families, unfortunately to say that, they have no choice but to work on improving their own situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kayla?
Sorry, I probably will add very little compared to Ali, but I just want to say that I think your point is so vitally important, and an article seems like such a small thing that we can do in this situation, but in that we have written along with Ali and Sharon, is taking that concept of human rights in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and actually just trying to make it something like that's relevant to their everyday. And that's where we've taken the ecosystems and the socio-ecosphere and tried to say that children are not in isolation, that has to be in relation to every system that they navigate and how that has been completely decimated. So I think when the article comes out, hopefully that does help in terms of thinking how we don't just see children in isolation. It's important in terms of how we think about individual children's rights and how they heal, but that needs to be done within a broader set of systems, their family, their parents, their carers, their teachers. Children need those things around them, and I think that's really important in how we speak about moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Tom. Just a show of hands, who's worked in Afghanistan or Iraq? So I guess we're all familiar with private security contractors. I think the GHF is something very different. And I think it goes to the point made by my WHO colleague around the attacks on humanitarians, the misinformation, the way they're being amplified. I think this is an attack on humanitarianism itself, and I think I think we need to pay attention. And I feel for colleagues, because I'm just sitting as a researcher now, which feels a bit more luxurious than being on the intense front line of a conflict like Gaza. But I do think we need to work on cutting through all the noise and the deliberate strategies of confusion and mis and disinformation, and we need to really get our message across here. And then I think we also need to put the necessary pressure on political actors to push it up as well, because we can't absorb this burden ourselves. And just even from the interviews I've been doing, they've been really difficult interviews with people on the ground. The trauma is... I don't think I've seen anything like it, even just amongst humanitarian workers themselves. So I do want to acknowledge that. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Yeah, I think how we can bring more women into the conversation, I think I will begin by actually acknowledging and reminding ourselves that the women in every conflict and humanitarian situation, and particularly so also in Gaza, have faced disproportionately the harm, the violence and abuse. And at the same time, I think the women and young women and adolescent girls also that we as Plan work with have shown resilience that sitting here, I don't even have words of admiration. I think what many of us are trying to do is to really find ways in which we are looking at a child-centered or a girl-centered approach, but to bring in, the wider community. And women, of course, play a significantly important part in it. In our learning centers, in our engagement on child protection, none of those things would be giving the level of results we would expect unless we are really bringing in the women in conversations. We are running, support groups. We are providing services, or engaging with partners who are providing specialized services to women who have, suffered sexual or gender-based violence right now inside Gaza, a lot of psychological trauma. I think the resilience that the women of Gaza have shown is something that the international feminist movement and organizations who believe in feminist principles should really be proud of. But it is also a moment, I think, for all feminist organizations and feminists in the world to also take a step back and see, have we, as organizations and individuals believing in feminism, stood up and supported and expressed solidarity to the level of the women of Gaza that they deserved?
I don't think so. I think that's what others
do we have any more comments or questions? Yes, up the back, down the front. We'll just see if there's anyone who hasn't asked me. Okay. Is there a third question? No, you go ahead. Yeah. Thanks. Up the back, sorry. Yes.
Sorry, yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, no worries. Thank you so much for the really interesting discussion right now. I wanted to go back to the kind of first set of questions that we were discussing on the humanitarian system and whether or not it's fit for purpose. So I come from programming in Myanmar at the moment, and there's actually some very frightening parallels between Gaza and Myanmar. And so you were saying that right now the humanitarian system isn't really fit for purpose for these protracted conflicts where it's more of a geopolitical issue rather than a pure humanitarian issue like a natural disaster. And so my question is, we're seeing decreasing development dollars actually more rapidly than we're seeing decreasing humanitarian aid dollars, even though we know that the appeals are underfunded across multiple different conflicts. But my question for you is, what can we do in that humanitarian development nexus to better serve folks on the ground with our humanitarian money, because we actually might have more humanitarian funding rather than development funding in some of these conflicts? So I would love to know what you would see as the most impactful interventions that kind of sit in that nexus work so that we can make our humanitarian funding work better, because it might actually be where we have the most money in some areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Was it down the front? Yes, thanks.
Thank you. I'm interested, you mentioned, a few folk mentioned, but I think you particularly mentioned there'd been around 500 violations, I think you said, of the ceasefire.
I wonder, could you elaborate on that, apart from the obvious one, people are still being killed, but just elaborate a little on what form those violations are taking. And if we could assume for a moment that the system was functioning as it should, what is the recourse for those sorts of violations? What should be happening that isn't?
Thank you. Good question. And the third question?
Thank you. This one's for you, Mudasser. Thanks for your presentation. Something you said caught my attention, that there's the bit about the increase in hope that children are experiencing, which is a nice thing to hear. Could you give us a little bit more background on what has caused that, or why we're seeing that now?
Thank you so much. Ali and Kayla, did you want to go first?
Yeah, just in brief, because I like the question about the humanitarian development nexus, and I think it's a very important issue to take into consideration, because Gaza or Palestine has been through recurrent waves of military operations and attacks on the systems and communities. And I think we cannot afford not to get the best use of the humanitarian aid to build a better functioning systems. And I think people around here are doing that. For example, I have been fortunate to work with the UN at some point of time. And the way we worked on women's health within UNFPA has been through not only building a demolished clinic, but try to build it in a way that it serves communities and it builds on best practice to maintain high quality services and yet be responsive to services. And I think when my colleague was describing that there is an effort of rebuilding the health system, and again, I was involved in some of that work, they should, and I think they are doing that, build it in a way that basically it provides the value of humanitarian response, but it maintains the development, meaning that it is capable of offering services beyond the time of the war. About the violations, I think my colleague who will answer on it, but we hear it every day in the news that first the yellow line is being moved closer and closer to the communities under the excuses that there has been violations of mobility. And 2 days ago, there were 2 children, 9, 8, and 11 years old, who were shot dead because allegedly they came closer to the yellow line, even though this yellow line is not visible for people. So that's really unfortunate, and I like the expression that my colleague was saying, that a deliberate, engineered process, I think, of annihilation, of ethnic cleansing, that is going on, but yet under the umbrella of the so-called ceasefire. Thank you.
Thank you. Kayla?
Can I just say firstly, thank you so much for people asking these questions, because I think we spoke about this previously, I think it's really great to have these conversations, but they're hard conversations. And Ali, on the ground, that's amazing you're able to share that information, but it's hard. And one thing that I think keeps coming up, and this is unhelpful, but I have a real bugbear with the word resilient, because I think that we cannot keep asking people facing these horrors to be resilient. And as I said, I was supposed to do my PhD in Palestine, and it was one of the first things I heard: the Palestinian people are so resilient. children are so resilient. We need to stop creating circumstances that ask children to be resilient. As Ali said, an 18-year-old to have experienced little else but war and conflict and extreme poverty and displacement, it's not okay, it's not enough, it shouldn't have to happen. And I think that it's amazing that children are so resilient, and I have worked with children for many years now. I then did my PhD in Colombia, where children are living in a post-conflict environment, but keeping to have asked them to be resilient, it's not enough. And I think we can do more than that for children than to just ask them to rely on that. So sorry, not very helpful, but I think it's so important to say.
Maybe I can briefly respond to the ceasefire question, was that? Yeah. There is a global trend that we've gone away from peace agreements to ceasefires, and I think that reflects the geopolitical dynamics as well. That, you know, I hate to use this as a cliche, but we are moving towards a might makes right world where decreasing respect on the resort to force, decreasing respect on the use of force in conflict. And this is why I keep saying, coming back to political pressure, like, I think a ceasefire can be performative, it can give the illusion, and when there's an asymmetric power relationship, that can be taken advantage of. And I think we can see that. So I think we need to keep attention on what's happening and that it isn't a ceasefire until we see something that looks closer to something that respects Palestinian rights, including the right to self-determination.
Thank you. In terms of the nexus, I think I'll just build up on what Professor Ali was saying with two things. One is that, you know, for the real nexus development and humanitarian and peace nexus work to happen, humanitarian system, the way it is funded, has to fundamentally change. You cannot expect a system to look at developmental and nexus issues if they have a 3, 9, or 6 months funding cycle. That just doesn't work. And time and again, in Myanmar, in Gaza, I was in Ethiopia during the Tigray crisis, that has been the expectation. But if that expectation is there, and should be, then the funding has to also flow in the same way. But most of the funds from, you know, the donor agencies are coming in these countries from their humanitarian bucket, which has a maximum 12-month horizon. These crises are protracted and they need multi-year long-term funding. Now, I also want us to be very careful when we say that yes, the development funding is going down, which is true, but there is no increase in humanitarian funding. There was never a situation, and I have been, 15 plus years in this, ever a situation where a humanitarian response plan was fully funded. Hasn't happened. So, yes, parts of humanitarian funding, the core humanitarian funding, may be cutting much less proportionately to what is being cut on the development side, but it isn't increasing. So I just want us to be very clear about that one. And therefore expecting that side with a very limited horizon to look at nexus, I think it's an unfair expectation unless we change the funding. Now, in terms of what is causing children to be more hopeful, I think it's, since the so-called ceasefire, is that sense of normalcy. They are able to go into these very basic temporary learning centers after 2 years for a child to go back into a sort of a school environment brings that sense of normalcy. They are able to get some basic nutrition supplies, more than what they were getting in the peak of the crisis, but nowhere sufficient to the levels that is needed. I would say these are the two key things which are really giving the children that sense of hope, because they are now being, to some extent, allowed to be what they are, that is, the children.
Thanks. Again, great questions. And I want to pick up on Kayla's point about resilience. You may remember the port explosion that occurred in Beirut a few years ago, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And, we went in, and I remember the Lebanese saying, whatever you do, don't call us resilient. They are sick of being called resilient, and you see this across other contexts. So I fully agree with that point. On the next, is the humanitarian system fit for purpose? One of my closest friends, very prominent in humanitarian action, he says the system's broken. I hate that term. I think it's a terrible reflection and sends a terrible message to frontline workers who are delivering selflessly every day. And I don't think we give the system enough credit for what it is delivering under increasingly difficult circumstances. Nonetheless, it's not well designed for the current constellation of needs, risks, and challenges. So we have to, turn that positively and jump on the opportunities. So humanitarian funding going, development funding going down. What can we do? First of all, we have to prioritise our priorities. So the UN is talking about hyper-prioritisation. Mudasser mentioned that each year we put out a humanitarian appeal. We never get 100% of that humanitarian appeal, the global humanitarian overview. On average, 60-65% of what we ask for each year is delivered. We also, in those humanitarian appeals, we always say, there are this number of people in need in each country, and we acknowledge the fact that we're not going to have enough money to meet the needs of all those people. So then we talk about the people we're going to target. So I think over the last 10 years, we've targeted around 78% of the people in need. Now with this hyper-prioritisation process, at the start of the year, the Global Humanitarian Overview, there are 305 million people in need. We said we were going to target 189. Now with the funding, we're going to target 114 million, 38% of people in need. And that's just dramatic. So you can draw your own inferences about what the consequences of that will be. Okay, so what else? We hyper-prioritise. We've got to shift these things, these approaches that were part of the grand bargain that we didn't implement adequately. Localisation and building capacities, not just transferring risks and transferring responsibility, being real partners with. We've got to look at the funding. And again, the grand bargain was talking about multi-year unearmarked funding. We've been talking about that for decades. Donors aren't buying in. And in the current climate, I don't think they're going to buy in anymore. But there's more we can do. We can do more with cash transfers, which empower populations more. We can do more with pooled funding. So, unfortunately, some of the big donors like the US just don't contribute to pooled funds, but they're options. Then, the nexus approach. The nexus approach for me, in terms of humanitarian action, is not just delivering stuff or delivering assistance. It's being conscious of the system in which you're working. And, I happen to work primarily in the health system. And it's building up the foundations, doing what you can to support the foundations of that health system, whether it's the human resources, whether it's the surveillance system, whether it's the supply chain, whether it's the physical infrastructure. And so using your humanitarian funding to support those key elements, a systems-based approach, and then hopefully transitioning and handing over the development actors. So, you're consciously delivering assistance at the same time of supporting systems as trying to lay a foundation for longer-term recovery and development. But it's getting, so that's the principle. but that's getting difficult. I'm sorry I've taken up a bit of time just on the recourse issue and the accountability issue. So this is the big problem, isn't it? There are well-established accountability and legal mechanisms to call people to account for violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and so on. So we mentioned the ICJ earlier, the International Criminal Court. To bring people to account, you need political will. The US, for example, is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court or a lot of other international conventions, right? And unfortunately, the record shows that for the International Criminal Court, there's, it's mostly people from the global south who are being held to account. So there are other mechanisms. It's not just IHL, and it's not just the ICJ and the ICC. The UN can impose sanctions, and there are denouncing mechanisms. There are national legal mechanisms. There's this concept of universal jurisdiction, where Vladimir Putin arrives in Canberra tomorrow. The Australian government is well within its rights to arrest him because there's a warrant. But unfortunately, all these things exist on paper, but they're not being implemented very much, unfortunately.
I think there are ICC arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Yeah, I think, just to be fair to international justice, and yes, there are well-established critiques around it targeting the Global South, I think we have seen it step up for this crisis. Like the ICJ has issued 5 advisory opinions at least, and then we have the ICC arrest warrants, but the gap is the political will. And that also comes as domestic political pressure in states as well, so.
Well, I just want to thank our panel. We're at time, but I'm really grateful to all 5 speakers. I couldn't have a better panel, and I'm really thankful to the audience as well. But just another big round of applause for our panel.
Sorry, and big round of applause to Annabel, because we wouldn't have been here without her organisation of it. So.